Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawn Kalea, and I'm the editor of Report on Business magazine here at the Globe and Mail. I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we're on is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This is unceded land, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on it. Though I'm also a firm believer that we need to go far beyond simple acknowledgement and actively participate in reconciliation efforts, including of the economic variety, allowing Indigenous communities and businesses to participate fully in the economy and fostering economic parity with the rest of the country. And I hope all of the companies represented here today are working toward that as well. The idea of economic reconciliation dovetails nicely with the subject of today's event, since so many of the projects required to support the transition toward clean energy touch Indigenous land. And the sad truth is that corporate Canada is still at the very beginning of the decarbonization process. Tracking which companies are making credible strides on the road to net zero is difficult for a whole bunch of reasons. First and foremost, because they have very few guardrails in terms of reporting on things like Scope 3 emissions, which of course account for 85% of emissions from the oil and gas industry, for instance. So you'd think that in our quest for global net zero, we'd want to work that into the equation. So where do we start? Well, as the famous, albeit somewhat flawed saying goes, you can't manage what you can't measure. And that's what Morningstar Sustainalytics is attempting to do with its low carbon transition rating, part of which forms the basis for this, our second annual Road to Net Zero event. Today we'll be joined by executives and industry specialists who provide insight on how to minimize the risks associated with the energy transition and how to capitalize on the myriad new opportunities it presents. Because let's not forget, this represents one of the largest potential corporate bonanzas in history. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to recognize Ericsson, Schneider Electric, and Royal Bank of Canada for sponsoring today's event. I'd also like to thank Sustainalytics, of course. Its team of analysts sifted through thousands of data points to calculate the low carbon transition score, and so far it has rated 8,000 companies globally, including more than 300 publicly traded corporations in Canada. To walk us through the rating, please welcome to the stage Clark Barr, Global Head of ESG Methodologies at Sustainalytics, who will be sharing his insights on the path to net zero and some takeaways coming out of the low carbon transition project.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn, and thanks to the Globe and Mail for bringing us here today on this very important subject. You hear about the climate crisis all the time, and we're really appreciative of our partnership with the Globe and Mail for reporting on that and using our ratings and integrating them into the Road to Net Zero report. So super happy to be here and also super happy to be involved in that report. So a bit about myself and about our company. So Morningstar Sustainalytics is an ESG ratings and data provider. So when I talk about this at parties, I say, basically we get a lot of inputs. We go out, we find signals from companies, non-financial signals. We don't look at revenue, we don't look at earnings per share. Those are financial signals, very important. But we look at the non-financial signals. So we look at things like, does the company have protections for whistleblowers? Does the company report its carbon emissions? And by the way, how high are those carbon emissions? So we take all of these data and we either provide it to our clients, those are typically investors who want this information for decision making. And they take these signals, we either provide them directly to them as those individual data points, or we package them together into a rating. And the rating that is involved in the Road to Net Zero is called the Low Carbon Transition Rating, as Dawn mentioned. And it's a measure of how well prepared companies are for dealing with the transition to a low carbon economy. So we do this across many products. We have products touching general ESG. We have products that look at our companies involved in producing controversial weapons, and then of course the one I'm going to be talking more about today, and which forms the basis of this rating, is the low carbon transition rating. Okay, so I wanted to start out, and maybe with a show of hands here from everybody, I want to get an idea of where you think we are on this question. So what proportion of the world's 2,000 largest companies, and this is the Forbes 2000, I think it's by market cap, what proportion of those largest companies have made a carbon reduction target? So for a show of hands in the room, who thinks 12%? Okay, a couple hands. Who thinks 35%? Okay, quite a few more. 72%? Yeah, a few. And who would say 84%? I think just one or two here I see. Okay, so I think that's good. The answer is 72%, right? And if we had looked at this a few years ago, I think we would have seen somewhere around 30 to 40%. So this is actually quite encouraging. It's that high. It's 72%. I think the majority of the room said 35%, so maybe this is quite a bit more than you thought. And this is actually in track with what we've heard. We've heard a lot of companies making net zero targets recently. But I want to go to the next question. So what proportion of those companies have a complete plan on how their organization will achieve net zero goals? Okay, so we've made the target. Now let's put together the plan. So who would say 2%? A few hands, quite a few hands. Who would say 18%? Okay, a few more. 32%? Starting to dwindle. Little skepticism. And who would say 60%? No one. Okay, the correct answer is actually 2%. And this is what we heard from our clients. Remember, our clients are investors, and they had concerns that when they were looking at companies, the companies had made the target, but they didn't have a plan on how they were going to achieve it. And this is actually why we created our product, is because we heard that feedback. They wanted to understand, were companies prepared for a low-carbon transition? And their sense, from even talking to the companies themselves, was that they didn't know how they were going to get there. There's significant business model transformation involved for many of these companies. It's not just taking lights, incandescent lights, and switching them to LEDs. That's the low-hanging fruit. A lot of it is significant business model transformation that requires a plan. It requires a strategy. It requires a lot of things to bring this all together. And there's skepticism that companies are really able and ready to do that. So what does our product look like? Well, we assess companies on their policies, their programs, and their performance. 3 Ps for us. Those are important things. So one thing is having a policy in place, maybe a target. I'm going to reduce my emissions by this amount. Then having a program to say, okay, now that I've made the target, how am I going to get there? What are the things I'm going to do in my company to get there? And then finally, performance. Let's see, do their emissions actually go down over time? So these are the things we look at. Over on the right of the screen there, you can see 4 data points. We collect hundreds of data points on companies. These are just 4 examples of things we look at. So on the low carbon transition rating, we take best practices from, this is largely inspired by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Many of you have probably heard of the TCFD. And so this best practices come from them, really feed into what we go out and collect on companies. So the first one up there is the CEO's pay tied to climate objectives? So you can imagine if my pay as the CEO is being impacted by whether we meet our climate goals, there's a little bit of incentive right from the top of the organization to go do those things. So we consider that a really strong signal when the CEO's pay is impacted by climate objectives. Then we look at things like an internal carbon price. So companies go out, they look at projects, let's say it's a steel mill. Okay, we have this option to build a new steel mill or a line in our factory. Do you integrate a carbon price into that decision? Because if you don't, you may actually make a different decision. You may go with a certain technology that maybe is a technology of the past rather than a future one. So companies that have that internal carbon price, it's a good signal for us that they're actually taking this seriously and that they're going to be able to make the right decisions. The third one there is performance on targets. So you can imagine it's a good signal for us when a company makes a target. They say, we're going to cut our emissions by this amount. And then we actually see that follow through in the performance. So we track that and measure whether they're actually able to meet those targets. And then the last one I'll mention here is the green procurement policy. And this is just to say that when we're looking at companies, we look across the value chain. So it's not just about the emissions you're producing in your factories or that you're getting from the electricity you buy. It's also about the products you're producing. So Don mentioned oil companies and those Scope 3 emissions that a lot of oil companies neglect in their target setting. Those are really important. Also, supply chain, and this is where this indicator comes in, and we look at do they consider environmental things when they're making supply chain decisions. We bring this all together, and you see, there's many indicators that I'm not showing here, but we get to a management score of between 0 and 100. 100 being good, 0 being bad. So this company on the left scores 78. It's just a hypothetical company. The one on the right, company B, it scores 46. So this can then go to investors, and they can make a different decision on this. Maybe the companies that they're comparing, company A and company B, on financial measures, they're very similar, but this can be a piece of information that they can use to help make a different decision. So now I want to talk a bit about Canadian companies and how Canadian companies fare. So, it's very important for me. I'm a Canadian myself, so it's great that we're able to focus on Canadians in this presentation. Even though we're a global company, Morningstar Sustainalytics covers 8 to 15,000 companies, depending on the product. But we do have, as Don said, over 300 Canadian companies that we measure with this rating. And I'm showing some stats up here about how Canadian companies score on 4 topics in the TCFD. So the TCFD has 4 themes: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And you see there that Canadian companies, this is a bit of a good news story, are actually performing a bit better than the global average. Now remember, we're including a lot of developing market countries in there, maybe countries that don't even have a carbon price like Canada does. So of course we are happy that Canadian companies are scoring better than the global average, but you see, when I was mentioning that score between 0 and 100, 100 being a company that was really following all the best practices, we have a long ways to go, right? So the scores there of Canadian companies on average scoring 33 on governance, of course, it's better than 0, but it has a long way to go to be really best practice in preparedness. We also see generally that companies are further along in their governance measures, so that's something like that CEO pay question I brought up earlier. That would go into governance and be a topic we manage there, or we assess there. They're further along in that, and also in setting those metrics and targets, setting the targets, as we saw in the first question I asked you. Companies quite good now at setting targets, but that's really the first step. And then I also wanted to mention, pick out some bright spots. So TransAlta is one of the companies we rate, a utility company, and they really excel at climate governance. So when we look at them, we see they have a strong risk management plan. They do have that CEO pay tied to emissions reductions. And they have a board member with experience with business model transformation. And so that's important for us. They have people who have skills that are needed for this complete transition that is needed. And it really is a road that companies are on, and it helps when you have somebody with experience to help guide them on that road. The next company, Algoma Steel, they lack reporting on a lot of critical components. So we don't see them reporting on a decarbonization plan. They don't have a plan disclosed about low carbon innovation. There is no GHG emissions reductions target, so they haven't even set a target yet. And they haven't integrated carbon prices into their decision making. So steel is an industry where a lot of transformation is required. Coal is very inherent to the production process there. And you can imagine for a steel company in 2030, 2040, the whole industry might look quite a bit different than it does today. And which companies are prepared for that different sort of landscape that they're going to be facing? Our rating would say, we don't really know enough about Algoma because they don't report on all of these topics that are really critical to understand how prepared they are. So Algoma, a bit of a laggard there. So I'd like to just close out by saying, the road to net zero, it is a journey. If you can imagine the road from Toronto to Montreal. You know, it's a fairly long road. I would say a lot of companies haven't even left the GTA. So they're very early on in the road. We do see some companies probably around Kingston, so they're getting part of the way there, but there's really not a lot of companies we see all the way at Montreal. You know, we're quite a ways away from that, but it is a journey, and it starts out with things like targets. It starts out with disclosing things, measuring things, and we are starting to see progress on that. So we see companies, not just in Canada, but around the globe, starting to take the climate crisis a lot more seriously. Is it as seriously as we would like, or many in this audience would like? Probably not. There's a lot of work to be done. You know, we're starting out with the low-hanging fruit, but there is, you know, some significant transformation needed on the back end, because in certain cases, we don't have solutions yet for how certain industries are going to get to net zero. And so there's a lot of innovation needed, a lot of transformation, and a lot of changes to businesses. So a few stand out prepared, but generally we see, you know, a lot of companies early on in this journey. But we do see the potential, and we hear it from our clients that they really want to identify those companies that are well prepared. They want to put their investment dollars in companies that are taking this seriously and are going to be prepared for that 2030, 2040, 2050 economy that could look quite different than it is today. So yeah, progress being made, but we're still a long way from getting there. I'd like to open it up now if there's any questions in the audience. Anything I've said? Sure.
In your earned, learned, considered judgment, do you believe that the government is enhancing or taking away in terms of their policy? Are the policies constructive in terms of effectiveness, or is it basically just political rhetoric? And also, on Comic-Con, what about the opposition? Are their quick bromides, are they being constructive or are they being deleterious? Thank you.
Sure, great question. I will, you know, state my expertise is in rating companies. I'm not a government rating expert, right? So although the government policies are very important to all of this, and I think of the example like TransAlta, probably one of the reasons TransAlta is a bit better prepared than some other companies is because it's in a regulated industry. And on that regulated industry, there are quite specific government rules and expectations around decarbonization. Not take anything away from TransAlta, but there is a lot clearer signals in that industry than some others. So in utilities, actually, the government, I think, is doing a pretty good job of mapping out what those utilities need to get to net zero. In other industries, it's less clear. So this is where we rely on pathway data, where experts, climate scientists, have gone out and they've apportioned budgets to different industries on how they need to drop their emissions in order to get us to net zero. Now, the governments take that and they integrate that and they find out, you know, how are we going to implement this in all of our policies? One of the ways they do that is through regulation and carbon taxes. We're a lot further along in Canada than we were 5 years ago. Is there things that we could probably be better at? For sure. But we're not the laggard in terms of government policy that we were probably 5, 10 years ago. Yeah. And the opposition, I don't know. I don't follow what they're saying. I'm following what the government in power is doing, right? So.
I might suggest that companies are trying harder to survive.
Worry about net zero, and I think that's a big challenge. Carbon tax is part of that, and survival that was priority, not net.
Yeah, so just in case anyone didn't hear, he was saying he was arguing that companies are trying hard to survive rather than focusing on net zero. And to a certain extent, that's true, I think, but I think part of survival actually is taking net zero seriously. When you look at some of the things that are coming down the road, especially the Europeans are much further along than the Canadians. If I had taken, I gave you the global averages, if I gave you the European average, you would have seen the European companies further along. One of the things that's being proposed now and being talked about is cross-border mechanisms where if your country and your companies within your country aren't taking climate seriously, they're going to face a tax on the imports into European countries. And these are going to be things that happen more and more. I think this is a really good step in the right direction. But that means that Canadian companies wanting to sell into Europe could be at a disadvantage if they don't take this seriously, right? So yeah, I think it is part of existing in the future, and it's, I recognize there's a lot of fiscal pressures on companies, but this is one more added into the mix, yeah.
My name is Sharon Avery. I work with the University of Toronto in the climate initiative. I know that Algoma is active in doing R&D with the university on aspects related to net zero, and you rated them really low. So when you rate them, as part of your due diligence, do you only look at the reporting that they do on publicly available information, or you go and interview with the company and look at the records and do more in-depth analysis for that? Because that will kind of give an idea about not how credible, but how strong is your rating of that company?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, is where we get our data from. It is publicly available information. So it's companies reporting in their annual report. Maybe a lot of companies now have integrated reports that also contain a sustainability aspect, or they might have a separate sustainability report. They report things in policies, programs, all over their websites. We get it from third-party data providers who've also have found different means of getting company data. So we go and collect all of that, but it is really information that's in the public realm. And there's a reason for that. You know, if we do reach out to the companies as well to get feedback on their report. So they have an opportunity to say, hey, you missed this, but we do actually have R&D related to, you know, green steel. And they could point us to that. They have the opportunity to correct that. But we don't take non-public information generally because, of course, the companies, it's in their interest to say things, and it's hard for us to maneuver whether this is actually something, is it actually something they have in place, or is it greenwashing where they're just trying to get higher points in our rating. I think the last question.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I'd like to follow up on that question. You know, I meet with a lot of companies, and I'm talking to them about Trellis Transit, and they have wonderful reports. But Algoma is an example of a company who is actually doing things. They built an electric arc furnace. Now, you've rated them low, but what I found is the companies that are best at telling the story actually are not interested in implementation whatsoever. So I'm wondering if your rating system is actually part of the problem. And I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm just saying...
No, that's a great question.
I'm just saying what happens is some of these companies are so focused on telling a great story, but when you sit down across the table from them, the last thing they want to do is actually implement a project. And Algoma did, because you brought them up as an example of a laggard. They actually invested in an electric arc furnace. They're running it. They're trying to create green steel. And they're the example of a company. I've not sat down with them, but if I sat down with them, they'd say, yes, we want to do things. So I'm a little concerned that your whole rating system is based upon, as you say, the public reports, the public persona, and not actually where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
No, that's a good criticism. I'm happy to address it. And this really goes to why we look at the policies, programs, and performance. This is where the performance, because we know there's other cases of companies that they report on certain aspects, or they might greenwash, they say we're doing all these things, but really at the end of the day, the performance is the important part. So does the company actually reduce its emissions? And that would come through from your example where, you know, they've invested in this electric arc furnace. We would see that in performance where their GHG emissions. And I only picked on Algoma just because it was a disclosure piece, so they don't, you know, they don't give that information. I would say in traditional finance, if a company didn't report on its revenue, if they didn't report on their segment data, investors would also go, hey, I don't have enough information to make the right decision. So same thing in sustainability. Like part of it is reporting, showing us so that we have that information, because otherwise we're just flying a bit blind in the dark. But I better get off. I think I'm at time. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Clark. That was a pretty entertaining discussion, especially towards the end. My name is Ryan McDonald. I'm an editor at The Globe. I lead a team of journalists, and we cover issues related to climate, energy, and the environment. And within that paradigm, we look at things like sustainable finance, climate finance, some of the issues around disclosure that we're going to talk about now. And so to that point, we are here to talk specifically about companies and what they're doing on disclosure. And I'm joined by Michael Torrance, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO Financial Group. And we are going to talk, I think this is the part of the program where you need to get your pen and paper out. There are going to be a lot of acronyms, but we're going to begin with talking about, I think, TCFD, which is the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. But there are, I guess, a number of things that have occurred since the advent of TCFD that we'd like Michael to sort of walk us through. I'm going to just start with a quote from somebody that maybe some of you will be familiar with. His name is Mark Carney. Mr. Carney chairs GFANZ, which is a global alliance of financial institutions that have pledged to further transitioning to low-carbon investments. This was at a House of Commons committee meeting, I guess earlier this month, that Jeff Jones covered. And what he said is that Canadian climate disclosure efforts have been patchwork, delivered too late, and are falling short of international standards. And then I think key is that he says that Canada's slow progress in building a sustainable financial system puts it at risk of losing investments and the job creation that it fuels. So Michael is not here to defend regulators and government inaction. He works for a bank. He's a chief sustainability officer, but he is here to tell us a bit about how companies deal with disclosure, why it's important, and sort of where we are at in the state of this very complicated universe. So maybe to begin, Michael, you could give us a bit of an overview of sort of where we are now in terms of disclosures for companies in Canada.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Ryan, for moderating this and for Globe and Mail for hosting it and for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be a part of this. So there's a lot kind of embedded in your question. Are we talking about disclosure? Are we talking about ESG and sustainability? I mean, maybe one way to kind of frame the discussion, the way I like to think about sustainability and why companies do it, it's really about meeting legitimate stakeholder expectations. And ultimately, that is a challenging thing to do. Historically, it may have meant basically complying with the law. Mm-hmm. But over time, particularly with globalization, that wasn't enough. And so there were legitimate stakeholder expectations from communities in which we work and do business, investors, of course, suppliers, customers, governments, to adopt good practice around the management of environmental and social impacts of business. Mm-hmm. So that was really the genesis of sustainability, and that became a field of understanding what that good practice looks like and then implementing it within a company. In around 2005, there was kind of an evolving way of thinking about that beyond management practices or international trade types of interests, investors became increasingly interested in sustainability as something that, in some investors' views, was a good indicator of how companies managed risk, were able to achieve their own performance goals, and could be a distinguisher from a financial performance perspective. So since that time, we've seen the rise of ESG-related investing. We've got the presentation about ratings and data to the marketplace about ESG and sustainability. And so now we're in kind of a new frontier, I think, of that, where it's moving from a kind of a highly decentralized, deregulated, market-driven phenomenon to an increasingly standardized regulatory phenomenon. And so that's where we find ourselves today. And I mean, I think we're going to talk today about there's a lot of competition, regulatory competition for what might be called regulatory share, and which standard will prevail. And so it makes for an interesting time.
Right. So, I mean, when we talk about all of these things that companies have to deal with, I know that one of the things that you mentioned to me previously was the sheer collection of data and what it means to not only collect this type of data, but making sure that you are collecting the right data, how to disseminate it. I mean, I think we've come a long way from some of the early sustainability reports that companies released to, I think, a much more sophisticated system in a fairly short period of time. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that data and what that means.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is all part of, again, this evolving ecosystem around disclosure expectations. There's many different frameworks. You alluded to the alphabet soup. Frameworks like GRI. There's others that are voluntary frameworks that have set some methodology around how companies will identify what's most important to their business and to their stakeholders. There's methodologies, and oftentimes it just comes from benchmarking or maybe looking at how you're being evaluated by rating agencies or others about how to measure impact. And so over time, these are becoming a little bit more refined with the emergence of the TCFD, which is, of course, a part of our discussion today. There are some more specific types of focus on metrics and reporting. And so in order to do any of this stuff, you need to have data. And that's can be an incredible challenge, particularly because the pace of change of the expectations is so great that data that you need to be able to do this well hasn't historically been collected or captured. One of the data challenges that I like to use as an illustration is there's an emerging biodiversity framework called TNFD, and it's using a LEAP methodology. The first question in LEAP is locate. Well, do we know where all the mines in the world are, or in Canada? Do we know where all the oil and gas facilities are? Do we know where all the buildings are? And you might know where all the buildings are, but can you align them to the owners of those buildings? Do you know where all the farms are? We actually don't, believe it or not, have ready access to that kind of data. And in order to actually implement the methodology needed to create metrics and to do reporting, you have to have that data. So this is an enormous challenge, not just for individual companies. It's an enormous challenge for governments and for industries as a whole to be able to find the tools needed to be able to solve these challenges.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned GRI, and I think GRI is now looking at biodiversity as well. Not to go too deep on the acronyms, but sort of the evolutionary track of TCFD has now gone to the International Sustainability Standards Board. There's the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, which have released, each one has released 2 recommendations. Maybe you can talk a bit about what those recommendations are and sort of where we are in those being implemented. I should mention that these are not mandatory in Canada, which is, of course, an issue that we're maybe not here to solve, but we should all be aware of it.
Okay. And just to be clear, I'm not working directly with ISSB, so what I'm saying is purely as an observer, and there's probably many people in this room who know much more about it than I do. But I mean, really, it is part of this phenomenon of trying to standardize and create comparability to create better decision useful information through consolidation of standards. That was one of their objectives. And also establishing a standard within an accounting framework, which has also not been the case previously. And as that is happening, there's other things happening. There's disclosure standards coming out of Europe. The US Securities and Exchange Commission has put out a rule that calls for certain types of similar disclosures. I think one of the initial theses behind the initiative of ISSB was that it would reduce the number of disclosure expectations. That may well in time prove to be true. I think though in the short term or maybe the medium term, it becomes one of all of the other standards and frameworks that you have. But there is convergence, I think, of sort of identifying what are maybe some of the leading ones. And TCFD is a good example where for climate disclosure, that is basically the leading framework that you would want to apply. And ISSB has pursued a couple of different tracks or a few different tracks. They actually just opened up their office, one of their offices in Montreal a few weeks ago. I had the privilege to be in attendance there, and several financial institutions, including BMO, had contributed to Canada's bid to have that office. So I think that's an interesting and good accomplishment for the country to make us close to these initiatives. The two key standards that we've seen so far, one is a general standard around sustainability reporting, and then the second is a climate-focused standard. And so again, this is within the context of the IFRS, which is a global accounting standards body, and they have this subgroup called ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is focusing on disclosure, but in a financial context. The CSSB, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, is an initiative to take what is coming out of the international body and try to assess how it could be implemented in Canada. So as that tells you, it's a very complicated process, and it still remains to be seen exactly how it will be adopted and applied. I do think that there's a risk of again, sort of competing and disparate types of standards that companies will have to contend with. But again, there's a lot of work being done to, as much as possible, standardize the approach.
Now, I know that you actually believe that things may become more complex, and that may be a necessity as well. So things may become simpler, or they may become more complex. What's your view on that?
Well, I think they're definitely becoming more complex. I don't know that it's the standards that is making it more complex. It's just that as topics like net zero and climate-related focus of business impacts, it is, I think, mainstreaming the adoption of methodologies like the GHG accounting protocol and others that require fairly complex analysis of value chain emissions, which isn't easy. And so as these standards become more pervasive as a part of public disclosure, then any publicly traded company at the least will have to begin to contend with how to do it. So that's one aspect of complexity. The simplicity part, I guess, is again this convergence where there is some convergence around what is considered to be good practice. And so over time, I think as data becomes more available and companies become more knowledgeable about how to implement this, then hopefully that makes it easier to adopt and implement. And then there's obviously going to be a question about what the standard should entail, and there's probably going to be evolution on that. What do investors really need? So there's still a lot of uncertainty on the topic.
And I mean, if you were to offer some advice to companies, I mean, obviously you work for a company, for a major bank in Canada. If you were to offer some advice to companies about how they navigate this system, these rules, these complexities that are coming down, what would it be?
I mean, I've always liked to think about all of these topics as being business problems and really core to the good management of business. So I think if you start from that premise, this isn't some like separate thing that you have to get your head around and why do I have to think about it? You should be thinking about this, what is important to your business? What are important to your critical stakeholders? And if it's about disclosure, then what do they need to know about what you're doing? And if you can think in that way, then you won't be adopting superfluous things that are not relevant, and you can focus in on the things that are the most important. And when it comes to this topic like climate, I heard it once said, it's a 100 gigaton challenge with a $10 trillion solution. And I think those numbers are probably underestimated by quite a lot. And what that, I think, tells you from a business perspective is there could be enormous opportunity related to this transition. Whether you think it ought to be happening or not, it's kind of beside the point. As this type of thing happens and new opportunities emerge, I think it's incumbent upon leaders in business to think about what that might be, how that could be an opportunity to be pursued. And then on the other side of the coin, there's also emerging risks. There's risks of actual climate change. We see extreme weather events, whether they're attributable to man-made climate change is again kind of beside the point, but when you see literally insurability of certain regions coming into question, it has a business implication. So understanding those trends, understanding what that means for your business, what kind of access to water do you need, what would heat stress do to your business, how do we manage these types of things, what kind of investments do we have to make towards adaptation or resilience or investment towards decarbonization that could benefit us from either a risk management or an opportunities perspective. That is a business consideration. You're not doing that for a values-based reason, for a moral reason. You're doing it because that's how a well-run business should be managed. And I think that is becoming the pervasive way of thinking about these topics is that these are core business problems and part of good governance.
I take your point on risk. I think a lot of the discussion around ESG is now starting to become more of a discussion around risk and competition, and whether as a company you want to be competitive in that space. I've got a couple of specific questions around banking for you. Obviously, one of the major issues for banks in Canada is around financed emissions, that is, emissions that are related to the fossil fuel sector. Can you talk a bit about what BMO is doing in that regard? And then maybe a secondary question would be, what is BMO doing around funding decarbonization efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2010, we began to quantify and disclose our operational emissions, which would be things like the buildings in which we operate, some travel-related numbers, the electricity that we consume. And we set a goal for ourselves to be carbon neutral with respect to those operational emissions, which to us meant, and how we've defined it, is to purchase offsets for any emissions we can't otherwise abate. We set certain targets for ourselves to reduce emissions over time. So that's quite a long time ago. Over those years, I think one of the major changes for the financial sector is that there's a view to the entire value chain, that maybe the biggest impacts of financial institutions isn't how you manage your own building-related emissions. It's actually maybe how you are related to economy-wide emissions. And so financed emissions is this concept about how do you quantify that impact. And certain standards have emerged, one called PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, where a methodology has been developed to assess financed emissions. There's also other organizations like the Net Zero Banking Alliance, or any organization related to GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where there are, again, methodologies or standardization of how to think about target setting around financed emissions. What are the assumptions you should use in doing that kind of thing? So, as these standards and expectations emerge, the reporting is beginning to happen. There's increasing questions around comparability, whether financed emissions are useful metrics and how they can be used by the marketplace. It's been quite a lot of effort from financial institutions to do this because, as I said earlier, some of this data is not really readily available. So it required entirely new processes to be implemented to be able to get the data that is now being disclosed. On the opportunity side, I mean, I think that's the most important and interesting aspect of this, because if you think about financed emissions, the counterpoint to that is you're accepting with financed emissions that financial institutions can have an impact on emissions, but the converse of that is that financial institutions have the ability to allocate capital to help facilitate potentially decarbonization or capturing new opportunities or innovation. There's been several examples of that within BMO that I find fascinating. We have developed a product like a retrofits product for commercial real estate. And some of the early learnings around that have been that it's a partnership with the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, where we've obtained a partnership to provide a lower cost of capital for deep retrofits of buildings. We've partnered with engineering firms to help do the initial environmental footprint assessment and determine what the decarbonization plan. And when you do some of that analysis, you can actually see that there will be a savings for the owners of those buildings if they were to do this decarbonization. So you see that synergy. And so we can be a catalyst because taking the initiative to do that analysis, to think it through, it's not dissimilar to any investment banking kind of pitch, right, but it really gets the discussion going. And there's been actual examples where this has not been on the roadmap of investment for firms, but once they've learned this, they've actually added it in. So we can be that kind of catalyst. I think it's incorrect to conclude that the financial industry is going to solve this issue. It's not about that. It's about being alive to the opportunities and to the good practices around risk management, playing the right role that we can to help our clients in their own journeys. And then for us, we also have created the BMO Climate Institute, which is an opportunity for us to potentially be thought leaders and to help, I think, elevate the dialogue around topics like this, which is, again, a role that we traditionally play, whether it's economics analysis or any kind of commentary, bringing together different groups to better understand these challenges. Those are the roles that we play. And if we do that well, and then other actors do their part, then that's what's going to, over time, I think, move us towards the policy objectives that we see.
Well, we've run over time, but I mean, all the clean tech people here, if you've got a project, pitch Michael. And I'm going to pass it over to James now.
Thank you, Ryan, and thanks to you and Michael for explaining all of the acronyms so I can now use them liberally with our next speaker. I'm really looking forward to the next chat, which is going to focus on how institutional investors' expectations of performance on sustainability and the climate transition are changing and what they're looking for from corporations, the kind of leverage that they can exert to help drive this forward. Barbara Zan is joining me. She's president and CEO of the University Pension Plan. She's globally recognized as a leading voice on sustainable investing, and I really do mean that. She's one of the best on this topic, so please give her a very warm welcome. Hi, Barb. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was loud. To start, institutional investors have such an important role to play here. They become so influential simply because of, if nothing else, the amount of capital they control. You know, collectively, we're talking about trillions of dollars of capital that can be directed in productive ways to help this transition. And I know institutional investors such as pension plans, like the one you run, have been doing a lot more engagement with companies to figure out how they're going to get where they need to be and not face that kind of risk of extinction that came up a little earlier. So just to set the table, what does in your engagement with companies about sustainability, climate plans, and net zero targets actually look like? How does that work in practice?
Sure. Maybe I'll just step back because not everybody, engagements is kind of a term. So
Sure.
Institutional investors have been, speaking with companies, engagements for decades. So Canada actually was leading way back when CCGG, or Canadian Coalition of Good Governance, was created. So I'm going to have just as many acronyms as Michael.
There you go.
And we focused on governance. And usually it's a multi-year conversation. Often it's with management. Sometimes it can be with the boards. And you try to talk about what investors see as some of the particular challenges and give the company an opportunity to respond. And often, because it is quite time intensive and laborious, you do it as a group because, for a large institutional investor, you can have thousands of holdings. So you're going to focus on the ones that are the most material, and you're going to usually work with a like-minded group, and that would be other institutional investors. So for climate, the one I'll refer to is called Climate Engagement Canada, and it began in 2021. It was one of the recommendations from the expert panel on sustainable finance that I was privileged to be a part of. And it really mimics a larger one called Climate Action 100+. So the Canadian one is focused on, say, the top 40 emitters. The global ones focus on the 100+ top global emitters. The Canadian one has about, call it 47-ish investors participating, $6 trillion. The global one has 700 investors plus, right? So we're really leveraging a lot of their work. And why we do this is we see it as climate change is a real risk and an opportunity for many of these companies. And we also think in terms of institutional investors, we are asked to invest in tech a lot and all these things, and sometimes it's just too far away from us. And so if we can help the companies with converting and thinking about climate change, they will make those investments in smaller companies and help spur the economy and help create jobs. And for Canada in this engagement, the top 40 emitters on the TMX is over 90% of the emissions of the TMX and about 1/3 of Canada's net zero targets. So it's significant. And we have 5 asks that we talk to them about, and not all asks with every company at the same time. But the idea would be is we form into teams and we go in and say, okay, all of these 5 asks, which are the most important for the company? So the top of the list is governance. So how do you have governance in your company about climate change? So this has nothing to do about data. This is what's the oversight of the board, who's responsible from a senior management point of view, because if you don't get governance right, the rest likely doesn't follow. The next would be, in your organizational strategy, how have you thought about climate change? Then what metrics and targets are relevant for that sector? And then we go in and we talk about disclosure. So you heard all the disclosure acronyms from Michael, so I won't repeat those. And then we also bring up their advocacy. Is it aligned with their stated objectives around climate change? And there's ways to actually get into that these days with Influence Map, which is another tool. So it's really a way for us to work as a group, but yet still maintain our investment decision-making and our own proxy voting type of thing.
And once you've been through that process, especially where you've got companies that are struggling to get started, to make progress, to get momentum, how do you help or compel them to work a little farther, or faster, or move a little farther? What are the tools that you might be able to use to help them, to give them a bit of a boost? Or what's the sort of leverage you have if you think they're not taking it seriously enough?
Yes, there's a few things we do. So we benefited from the fact that Climate Action 100, so that big global initiative, started about 4 years before us. So they worked as a group and said, okay, we're going to help companies with some, when your kids are in school and you get a rubric notion of how you get your grade, the same idea as a benchmark assessment. So there's 10 indicators, and we'll go right down to what are the sub-indicators. So we'll help them go through that. So we do that for every one of the companies, and you can actually find that online through a link on our website. And so we are able then to compare the companies to their sector peers and their global peers. And the challenge we have, though, is Canadian companies are behind the global companies. So when we look at our global peers, 57% fully disclose their ambition, so all of that 100-something. In Canadian, it's 15% of those companies, so 6, right, 15%. 41% of the global peers have long-term GHG reduction targets. It's 5% of the Canadians. Taking into account part marks, there is over 40% of the global companies that can talk about how their capital is aligned to the 1.5 degrees scenario, and not one of the Canadian companies are disclosing that in their reports. So we can bring those aggregate, and we can bring those individuals' data to the company to do that. The other tool that investors have, and this is, you do this on your own as proxy voting, we each will produce our own proxy voting guidance, and you can find ours on our website. Most of the large institutional investors will publish theirs. And so when you have to vote for directors, we have made it clear that we see they are responsible for the oversight of climate. Their skills matrix include climate. In different industries, it's different levels, but especially for some of the bigger, more energy-intensive industries, we don't support the re-election of board members, so it could be individual, could be part of it or a whole, if there's not a right oversight of climate. And for more energy-intensive, we have put in there that if we don't see good progress on decarbonization strategies, we won't vote for directors. So, and you're seeing this trend more and more, and you're also seeing shareholder proposals by institutional investors and others to call it informal feedback, James. And I'd like to highlight one informal feedback. In Australia, there is a big LNG provider called Woodside, and it did a say on climate with its climate plan, and it was actually turned down by investors as being insufficient.
Yeah, I saw that. I think there was something like a 58% vote against, and I think it's the second year in a row that the company's not had a great vote on that. What happens then? What do you do next in order to really turn that kind of pressure into action?
Right, so you stop voting for their board members, so that usually is helpful. Some investors will leave, right? I can tell you, I have, last week, another divestment proposal on my desk. Right? So we get a lot of pressure to divest. You'll see that more and more. You're seeing, I'll call it the big Dutch pension plan, PGGM, recently took the Climate Action 100 data and said, I'm going to only invest in oil and gas companies that are actually doing something. So they created an index, I think it's 9 companies, and that's it for their oil and gas sector. So you're starting to see that more and more. You're starting to see index providers provide, based off forward-looking information, customized indices that people are experimenting with. So I think you're going to start seeing more tick up of that as well.
And you mentioned some really striking stats on ways in which Canada is in some cases lagging other parts of the world on data and disclosure. I was really struck a little while ago. I was covering the sustainability report that had been released by the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, the big Quebec pension fund. And on one hand, it was a really good news story. They were meeting their targets ahead of schedule. The intensity of the carbon emissions in their portfolio was down 59% from when they set the targets. On the other hand, they quite candidly admitted they didn't have data, reliable data they trusted on 59% of the assets in their portfolio in terms of carbon. So what are we missing here in Canada? Why are we lagging on that kind of data and disclosure piece, and what could we do to change that?
Yeah, so I'll take advice and counsel on the latter. But back in 2021, so after the expert panel, one of our recommendations was, when you write those reports, it's pretty high level. You get a page maybe per recommendation. We recommended that the government, for many of these, work with the industry and really put the meat around the bone kind of. I'm horrible at analogies, so put it there. So they created something called the Sustainable Finance Action Council. And it was the 25 largest financial players in Canada, and said, work on 3 fundamentals. One, data, which I think Michael spoke about. There's lots of data that we're missing, both on emission as well as for physical risk. Like our flood map data is unfortunately dated. It's old. It's not detailed enough. So how are you, as someone who's about to build buildings or fund the building, ensure that they've done the right physical risk analysis if those underlying maps don't exist? And that's something that should be done collectively. So lots of different data. Disclosure is another topic. I've been on disclosure for a long time. ISSB, the one that Michael was speaking about, that came from 2 sources, the TCFD, but also SASB, which is Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. I can remember being in a small hotel room, or kind of even a couple tables, 15 of us, talking about how do we promote this, and this was probably 15 years ago on a voluntary basis, because investors thought it was important that directors saw this information and that we had access to this information to make better decisions. So this has been a long time asked, so it's really nice to see the progression. We always knew it had to get into accounting standards to make it a global standard. So the work is now beginning with ISSB in 164 jurisdictions. That means each one of those jurisdictions now have to adopt those in hopefully large share as is. So we don't have, today we have a voluntary alphabet soup. We don't want mandatory alphabet soup in accounting standards. And so we're really working through that, and Canada's in that process, but anything we can speed it up, that would be to let companies know they need to get started, because Michael spoke about the Europeans. The ISSB is called financial materiality. So what is the impact on you as a company? The Europeans are doing dual materiality. So it's both ways, and it's estimated that there's 1,300 Canadian companies that will be impacted by that reporting framework. So we better get going getting these companies ready, and we have an outsized impact on our companies as compared to the US companies. The last one is the one I've been personally working on for a while, is a taxonomy. How many people know what a taxonomy is? That's pretty good. It's not from biology class for the others. So think of it as a classification system, or a way to say, is this investment green? So that means it will be as is by 2050, right? So solar is a great example. Or is it something we need to do along the way? So transition. Think of it, I use the energy saver analogy when you buy your dishwasher, right? You go and there's usually a sticker that says how energy efficient that dishwasher is. How many people ever question that rating when you buy your dishwasher? None of you, because you count on standards in a way that's disciplined, that's science aligned for that dishwasher. We are asking for the same thing. Because investors, even though we have access to all this stuff and things, we're not trained in these things, nor will a foreign investor be able to piece together how to align investments with Canada's net zero transition. So, today, I would say you get better environmental information about that dishwasher than you do in your investments, right? Like, when was the last time you saw anything about that mutual fund or ETF that you were buying? And that's fundamentally what Europeans were trying to do with their system. So I think we really need, the data, disclosure, and taxonomy. And just so you know, it's not a new thing. There's over 40 regions in the world either have one today or are working on it. You know, we produced our paper in 2022. Australia took our paper. They were behind us. They will be publishing their consultation paper tomorrow for 3 sectors: electricity, mining and minerals, and building. And they've gone and got going. How we move here, I don't know exactly the answer. I'm open to suggestions.
And just quickly to put a finer point on why that matters so much. I've heard you talk before about how a Canadian sustainable finance taxonomy will help attract capital to the country and help prevent against greenwashing. How does it do that? How much is it going to move the needle if we get that taxonomy right on those 2 things, capital and greenwashing?
Oh, it would move, like, so the experiences now in places like Europe, et cetera, who have had it for a while, they have now seen how investors are using it to align their portfolios and how companies are using it to help inform their strategy, right? So it's a matter of getting dollars to us. And so, you know, organizations are making commitments, like the banks. They're part of Net Zero Banking Alliance. We're part of Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. We're starting to make our sustainable finance commitments. We're speaking to it about our members. So we are all using what is already out there today. So the EU, Climate Bond Initiative, other taxonomies, and using that for the relative region. What is missing is there's nothing that is particular for Canada. So Canada is a big country, you know, cities went in different spots, north, south. Singapore, like how would a Singapore taxonomy actually apply to Canada when it's one city, right? So this is why they all have some commonality. They are all science aligned. They're all 1.5 degrees. And it removes the chaos and confusion of BMO having one version, TD having another version, us having another version that doesn't provide clarity to anyone to try to get financing or for the equity investor to use it.
Time's short, and I want to let the room ask a question or 2 before we run out. But just quickly, a lot of people I think in the room today are responsible for net zero plans at their respective organizations. If you can just tell them one thing in terms of what investors are looking for, what's that?
So go back to the objectives of Climate Engagement Canada. So if you're a board member, you know, it's about start with your governance. So do you have oversight? Do you have the skill set on your board? Does your skills matrix have it? So all those disciplines that you have as a board, how does climate interplay? Which senior management person or executive team person has this file? How is it integrated into the organization? And then there's a wealth of data that you can get from this initiative, Climate Engagement Canada or Climate Action 100 Plus. If you're one of those companies, you can see where you rank, or you can look at your peers. How are they doing? You know, we are very mindful. Not it's a journey, and it's a different journey for every sector. So doing that sector comparison would be great. If you happen to be an asset owner or a manager, you can call me because we still need more participants.
Okay, I do want to give the room a chance to ask a question. If anybody's got one, please put your hand up. We'll get a microphone to you so that everybody can hear it. Is there anybody who'd like to ask something of Barb before we finish up?
We talked, you mentioned a little bit about how are we going to get this done, right? We've had disclosure policies in place on many topics before, and we've seen them effectively not move, right? I'll take gender diversity on boards as an example, right? So elsewhere in the world, they put quotas in, it moved. We decided to take a comply or explain approach, and it moved nowhere in 15, 20 years. So I realize it's a provincial jurisdiction on markets and public companies, but first question is, would CSA make that different for disclosure? And then, you know, what do you think, given our historical poor performance in doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do? What would you say?
Yeah, so the question is around the CSA, the role of the CSA. So CSSB, or the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, adopts the standards, and then when they start applying. So CSA then applies it to companies. and they can make other exclusions. So absolutely, they could create the voluntary alphabet soup for reporting. I would say that it is beholden to we as the investors, the people who put money out the door, to keep asking for the disclosure, right? I think people think it's disclosure for disclosure's sake, but the belief is, and we see it in the data and analysis from places like Harvard and Oxford and Stern, et cetera, that these things matter, they have a material impact, and we actually think the boards are accountable for this, and the board should be seeing this information, and that investors would like to see it from their investment point of view. So investors will still have their proxy votes. They will still vote board members, right, for their things, and we should be using that lever. We will continue to use engagement levers. We'll continue to do the consultations for CSSB as well as for each province, because I think the hodgepodge or the voluntary, it actually ends up being more work for companies, not less. So we have the opportunity actually for Canada to show leadership. Like, we have a CSS or an ISSB office. There's only 2 in the world, Frankfurt and Canada. Why would they stay if we create the hodgepodge of reporting in Canada? And let's understand is the federal government put money behind it, but also a lot of the financial institutions put money behind it because they thought this was really important. So I think we all have to get on the same page that this isn't disclosure for burden's sake, this is disclosure because we think it's really important sake.
Thank you. That was a great question. Does anybody else have one? If not, I can ask another. Yep, right down front here. Can we pass the microphone? Oh, there you go.
Thank you. When we talk about the ESG methodologies or standardizing the standardization for the net zero transition, lots of companies are interested in generating more and more capital than investing in the greenwashing or sustainability plans in the long run. If we take the data for the last 3 decades, like especially in North America, US and Canada are competing in generating lots of capital through mining and other, real estate and also other negative standardized targets that are, for especially defense sector and other areas of interest. So, but again, Scandinavian countries are way ahead, like in terms of the sustainability or, net zero challenges in terms of addressing like clean energy partnerships, for example. So I think we are again, kind of behind with these targets, and I don't know like how these companies are kind of moving forward with their individual plans. I think we need some kind of universal standardized, universal formulas or some kind of different strategies to. So this is kind of my opinion. I don't know how companies are going to address these things.
Yeah. So universal standards will come through ISSB. If you do ISSB, or CSRD and ISSB are aligning at least for the financial materiality part. So that guidance was produced out. I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'll try to quote it. I think over the last 10 years, what was the highest growth sector in Canada? It was clean growth, exports. It grew at 9.4%. So I think we keep talking about the old industries, but I think part of the taxonomy is trying to get money to the green. Part of engagements is to get companies to make the net zero commitments so that they then invest in those technologies. During the expert panel, though, many of the challenges still exist for the smaller companies. One is, I can't remember the term, but the fact that we have every different province and every different regulation, right? Right now, if you're a clean tech company, you can go to California. It's a very positive, supportive regulatory framework and has just as many people as in Canada.
Right.
right? That is what we're up against. And so I think we have to look, there is another paper not yet on the website. The government is a little tardy on updating the website for the Sustainable Finance Action Council, but we were talking about how do we remove barriers for companies. And one thing that we identified was the fact that you can use procurement, and we noted it in the expert panel report, as a way to support these companies. So government gave funding to Algoma for green steel. Why aren't we also buying green steel? How do we help people buy green steel? And so that would then help all the new technologies. And so I think we have to think bigger. Data disclosure taxonomies forms the foundation so you can actually assess if transition plans are credible. But there's many other things to help really the growth in the economy that we try to articulate and yet to be published.
Well, that's a good hopeful note to end on. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to really, really thank you for joining us, Barb. That was really interesting. And I'd like to now welcome to the stage our next speaker, Xavier Biot, VP of Digital Energy at Schneider Electric Canada. Take things forward from here.
So I arrived 1 year ago, more or less, here in your beautiful country. As you can hear to my very strong French accent. English is not my first language, right? I'm from Belgium originally, right? And when I've taken the role about 1 year ago, people in Europe, where I'm from, told me, hey, Canada, it's going to be cold out there. Sure you want to be there? So now I spent about 1 year and I saw one winter in your wonderful country. I was in Toronto, I have seen nearly no snow. We have been here with the hottest winter in the last 90 years. So there is really, on top of the business imperative, doing sustainability is good for business, there is really an urgency to act and to do something if we want to leave a planet for our kids to live on. I have 3 kids, and I want to do something for them. So I'm working now more than 25 years in Schneider Electric. I'm the Schneider Vice President of Digital Energy for Schneider in Canada now, about 1 year ago, right? Now, I'm here because this road to net zero is the way forward. There are solutions for that. Those solutions are existing today. We are able to decarbonize more or less 70%, 70, of the carbon emission of this planet with technologies which exist today. Just need to apply them, and apply them now and fast. So I'm happy to have seen the energy in the room, people wanting to go forward, the financing elements which are also aligning because it's good for finance, it's making business to do sustainability again, right? We are Schneider Electric. We are a sustainability and technology leader. That's what we do. We build the technology which are there to decarbonize, to electrify, and to digitize our world using automation, right? Technology which is existing today. So I'm here for a green minute. It's already more than a minute, right? So in this green minute, what we wanted to make you reflect on where you are in your own decarbonization journey, right? And to try to inspire you to accelerate quicker, right? Now, I'm going to introduce you a video of one colleague of mine. It's called Frédéric Morancy. He's the leader of sustainability and strategy for Schneider Canada, right? I want to talk to you about what does it mean to be an impact company. Can you please launch the video?
Hello, I'm Frédéric Morancy, and I'm leading sustainability and strategy at Schneider Electric Canada. Thanks for joining me for this Green Minute. Schneider Electric is a technology company focusing on electrification, automation, and digitization with sustainability at its core. Today, I want to embark you on this journey to become an impact company. And I want to ask a question. Is there really a choice to be made between progress and sustainability? It is widely accepted that positive ESG impact could have better outcomes for organizations in terms of talent, resilience, and growth. But it is easier said than done. Our world is in constant flux with health, social, climate, and energy disruptions that are difficult to predict and to manage. To achieve this, they really need to deeply rethink who they are, what they do, and how they're doing it by really embracing the impact company principles. The first principle is your company needs to be part of the solution, with ESG program embracing the full ESG dimensions. The second principle is you need to bring everyone along, setting up for global and local impact, and really embarking all your stakeholders alongside with you. For some, delivering on ESG and sustainability commitments is more about compliance than creating a competitive advantage. However, impact companies treat sustainability as a source of performance, innovation, and growth. Thanks for joining Schneider Electric Green Minute. And now I invite you to initiate your own impact company reflections around you. Thank you very much.
So that was 1 minute. Not sure you count it, right? So I hope this inspires you to accelerate your decarbonization journey. Now, I was the last slot between you and your break. So it's break time. I will be here with 2 colleagues. Do not hesitate to contact for further discussion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. We're about to get our next conversation started, so if you could please take your seat if you haven't already. My name is Rita Tritcher. I'm a senior business writer and columnist here with the Globe and Mail, and I'm very, very pleased to moderate this next session. Businesses can encounter a range of challenges and complexities when starting or progressing through a net zero program. So our next interview will be outlining barriers and success strategies for building alignment externally. Please join me in welcoming JP Gladue. He's principal of Mokwate, and Apoorv Sinha, who is joining us remotely. He is the founder and CEO of Carbon Upcycling Technologies. So thank you both for taking part in today's discussion. We're going to get started. I don't see Apoorv up on the screen. Oh, is he there? Okay, I'm Apoorv. I just can't see you from where I'm at. How are you?
Doing well, Rita. Good to
great.
talk again.
So we're going to get started by just a question for both of you. And Apoorv, why don't we start with you? Just want to hear a little bit about what you both do and as it relates to today's topic. So Apoorv, let's start with you and then we'll move to JP.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me. My name is Apoorv Sinha. I serve as the CEO of Carbon Upcycling. Carbon Upcycling is a carbon capture and utilization company. We've been focusing on a technology to take carbon emissions from point sources such as industrial plants, such as cement or steel plants, and essentially converting those carbon emissions into solid products that actually afford a use for the CO2 that we otherwise emit into the atmosphere. A huge amount of our focus over the last few years, Rita, has been the building materials sector. Cement makes up about 8% of global emissions every year. And as we decarbonize our energy sector, we expect that number to get, that portion of the pie to get larger. And our technology not only helps these cement companies decarbonize and sequester some of the emissions in their production schemes, but also helps them make a more sustainable circular product to sell to their customers. And so very, very excited about the work we're doing there. But overall, our mission is to find ways of mineralizing carbon emissions in scalable ways such that we can really help decarbonize not just cement, but many other hard-to-abate sectors by providing them an alternative or at least a complementary solution to carbon capture and storage underground.
Great. JP,
here in person with us. You wear many hats. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your interest in this particular topic.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Mokwete, for those of you who are wondering what that means, it's my Indigenous name. I'm Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario. It means bear heart. I have a firm that we work nationally across sectors. I do a lot of executive work. I sit on boards like the Institute for Corporate Directors. I sit on Suncor's board, mining company boards. I'm a forester by training. So the natural resource sectors is a place I'm very familiar with. And I actually live in my First Nation 2-hour drive north of Thunder Bay. When I'm home, it's a beautiful place to be. I've been on this chair the last few years. I used to be the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and it's really about communicating that economic reconciliation is Canada's competitive edge. In this country now, we're seeing that anything to do with greenfield projects, natural resource projects, the ability and the competitiveness, I believe, of our country is starting to really come around to the idea that we've got to have our Indigenous relationships in check, and we can get into more detail about what that actually entails. But you know, things like access to capital, regulatory, human capital, our country shifted significantly when it comes to this relationship. And what you think you might know about our people, and it might be only part of it. There are certainly a lot of challenges, but there are some incredible advances that have been happening, and I love sharing those stories. So we'll see where this conversation goes.
Okay, JP, we're going to stay with you for a second. Okay. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition partnered with your firm on a national report on Indigenous-led electrification.
Yeah.
Now, what would you say are the key takeaways from that report that people should know about?
I always mess this one up, so I wrote it down this time. But this came from one of the conferences a few years ago. We just had one here in Toronto, 1,700 people. Leaders, CEOs from banks across the country in the US, the Maori, the Indigenous people of Australia, a massive conference. The one key thing, and let this settle in, is that the only road, and we're talking about road to net zero, the only road to net zero runs through Indigenous lands. Just let that settle for a second. If we want to be able to build out the infrastructure and the generation opportunities in this country, we've got to realign that relationship with the Indigenous nations. And so this electrification project, please, it's hot off the press. You can go to our firm or the First Nation Major Projects Coalition's website to download the report. But it really does identify, we've got a 2 to 3.5% increase in the amount of infrastructure that's needed, $1.7 trillion by 2030, like 58% increase in real GDP when it comes to the value that this clean economy will drive for our country, as well as, a third of new clean energy, renewable energy projects in this country are, Indigenous nations are our third largest asset owner. And we want to be a part of this transition. Anyways, the report goes into recommendations for industry, for governments, for regulators, as well as Indigenous communities. So it's really a nice roadmap to think about how we're going to progress together. And one of the most frustrating things that we see in this country is that we've got, when you look at the grid in Canada, there's a lot of north-south, north-south. I mean, heck, we're giving away a lot of our energy down to the States for next to nothing. But yet we can't decarbonize the oil sands. Why can't we get enough east-west? Enough of the bickering between the provinces and territories. Maybe it's time for Indigenous nations to step up to break up those interlockers to make sure that we can actually get the transmission and the infrastructure that's required to actually make us more competitive in this country.
Okay, well, that's a fantastic idea. Apoorv, I'm going to just pivot to you. And what have been your key learnings on how to get meaningful engagement from your partners rather than just small pilot projects? What have you done that's worked?
Yeah, one thing I just want to say before I answer your question, Rita, I couldn't agree more with what JP said about, working east and west as much as we do interprovincially, up and down. I remember being part of an Action Canada cohort a few years ago and hearing about this. And I just wanted to echo that I completely agree with everything JP said there. I think there's a huge opportunity for Canada to be a leader in that and use resources that we have available. I would probably just reinforce some of the things JP said about how some of these infrastructure projects are going in where we've seen some of the challenges in projects moving in heavy industry contexts as well. I think what's worked really well for carbon upcycling so far is we've understood and recognized that there is a massive corporate momentum towards net zero targets and decarbonization, like tangible movements towards decarbonization between now and 2030. But at the end of the day, what we see at the operating level is that the day-to-day, the quarter-to-quarter kind of priorities that these organizations have are still very much driven by bottom line kind of priorities. And much of it boils down to other value propositions or risks they see to business as usual. Carbon is, candidly, I think more of a 5 to 10 year horizon on what are the key risks they see to their business. But I think what's worked with carbon upcycling is really tailoring what we provide to these folks as a way of increasing supply chain optionality, increasing the ability to look at volatile feedstock constraints or cost differences or changes that they might see, especially in the peak market. And so I think the big lesson for us has been that if you want them to do something that's larger than a pilot project or kind of a bench scale demonstration or whatnot, you have to be able to speak their language around what type of business drivers are you helping reinforce and improve, or what are systemic business risks within a 1 to 2 year time horizon that you're helping them address in a meaningful way with a technology or a business idea that you have. And definitely when it comes to these heavy industries, whether it's steel or cement or even the energy sector that JP was talking about, I think, the onus, I think, is on the startups and the entrepreneurs to really come up and tell that multifaceted story without kind of just expecting, the carbon mandate to do all the heavy lift in terms of building that sense of urgency that we all need. Okay, let's talk a little bit about public policy. I want to know from both of you, what are your key asks of the various levels of government? I'm going to start with you, JP.
All right. Well, the Indian Act is a debilitating, paternalistic old piece of legislation that has not been designed to provide Indigenous people, First Nations, largely any ability to determine our own future. As an example, I live in my reserve. How many of you are able to leverage your house, your asset? Most of you, if you own it. I had to pay, go into my savings to build my house because I couldn't go to the bank to get a loan because we can't own assets on the reserve lands. If you can't own assets, how are you supposed to leverage your wealth to invest in other opportunities? And that's one of the biggest challenges. So from a policy perspective, we've got to create affordable capital pools for Indigenous communities to access, and that's happening now. Provincial programs, the federal government just announced a $5 billion loan guarantee program here in just this last budget to empower so that our communities can access that. And when you start to do that, you start to see partners coming to the table, like Ontario Hydro going, like, listen, 50% equity opportunities for communities in transmission. BC just had a call for power, 3,000 gigahertz of energy and 25% minimum. And what that does is it actually creates an opportunity for our nations to work together. Because now we're going to build something together. We're not on the outside fighting. Of course, we're going to say no to any kind of projects in our territories if you're going to come in, mess up our lands, and then we don't get derive any benefits from those. So these are real opportunities to create real partnerships, to build out our socioeconomic well-being in our communities. That's one of the biggest important policy shifts that we've seen. Also, regulatory. We're also really challenged in this country to figure out the regulatory system. And the way that things, engineered projects in the past get done, you do all the hard work, you get all your smartest engineers in the room, and you figure out how you're going to build this. Then you come to communities and you go, what do you think? Well, you're asking us too late. You should have asked us at the beginning. And so the regulatory, having Indigenous leadership at the front of the room, driving through the regulatory process is just, that's what you got to do these days. So creating more, and that's regulatory reform and having more Indigenous oversight. You're going through our territories, and we want to be there with you, and we want to develop largely with you as well.
Okay, that's These are all excellent points. Apoorv, what about you? What's on your wish list for government in terms of policy?
Yeah, I think, if I was to kind of put this down to kind of a pithy phrase, I would say they need to speed up and simplify. One of the things when we were discussing this, Rita, a few days ago, like in preparation for the panel, we talked a little bit about just the cultural attitude in Canada around innovation and taking some of these risks with new technology deployments and things like that. There's a thing we hear about a lot from venture capital folks about how Canada is a great testing ground to prove out a technology, but then if you want to scale it, you move down to the States. And there are a litany of examples of where that's been true. And I think policy just needs to be mindful of this. And I would say there's been a lot of momentum around building up CCUS investment tax credits as an example for any carbon capture or utilization projects, even storage projects. There's been work around the contract for differences from a carbon levy perspective. And these are good. They definitely need to be sped up a little bit in terms of actually getting dollars into projects in the ground. But I think ultimately speeding up and simplification, I think is really the name of the game. Like we need to make this easy enough so that when you're talking to foreign capital allocators that are looking to invest in Canada and looking at doing projects to decarbonize our footprint nationally, they don't want to go into kind of the nitty-gritty details of how we're looking at decarbonization with one pathway versus another. They expect these very sophisticated private players to have done a lot of that due diligence, and a lot of that framework already exists. And I think sometimes where we maybe get a little bit lost is we try to add these checks and balances to make sure that things are being done to the like as per the intent of what's being sought, but a lot of times that can lead to overcomplication and how these things get rolled out. And I think some more trust in the free market and really just kind of trying to move as quickly as we can, especially acknowledging the fact that we're so abysmally behind where we need to be to hit our 2030 targets, let alone being net zero by 2050. I think those would be the pieces where I think policy can increasingly play a catalyzing factor in helping that cultural shift for us to be more entrepreneurial and trying more things in Canada, not just to test out ideas, but to scale them. But I think thus far, even going back to JP, some of the comments you were making last week, perhaps it has been playing more of a negative factor, maybe more than a positive one. So I think there's a lot of room for potential improvement there in the short term.
Yeah, just to give some love back, spending time with you, it's been great. You're absolutely right. We've got to get a lot faster. We can't attract any capital. I mean, everybody's got investment opportunities in the world. Where are you going to go? To a country that's going to take 10, 15, 20 years to get something built? Or are you going to invest your money somewhere where you're going to get returns? So we've got to absolutely become a lot quicker. And then empowering these folks like Apoorv is just like incredible. Like I circle back around to my Suncor colleagues and they go, yeah, we know who he is. He's a very remarkable young man. And these technologies, it takes time, but we got to empower. And the only thing I would say is, we talked a little bit about picking winners and losers. Canada sometimes gets too much in the spreading peanut butter. We've got to really invest in the winners, and we got to incite that entrepreneurial spirit here in Canada. We've got to be able to keep that talent and grow the businesses here in Canada, instead of just like getting them started and where do they go afterwards, because we don't have enough incentives to be able to drive their passion to build their companies domestically. We've got some challenges, but we've got a lot of bright people working hard at these issues.
Okay, well, we only have about 3.5 minutes left. This conversation, the time has just flown. But I want to try to get some questions from the audience. If anybody has a question in the audience, from the audience for either JP or Apoorv. Do I see any hands? Sorry, I'm short. I can't see over the podium.
There's one over there.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah, just a quick question for Apoorv. You talk about carbon upcycling, which I understand to mean take carbon dioxide and actually make physical products like carbon fibers and so on, as opposed to jam it into the ground under carbon storage. If you had a base case and what I will call a stretch target, how many tons per year do you think of CO2 you would use to make carbon upcycling products today, say by the year 2030 and by the year 2035? Both a base case and what I call a stretch target.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head with regards to what the value prop is. I would say just two quick things, just in case we can squeeze another question in. Number one, I would say we have abatement and sequestration. So cement is a very high carbon footprint material. We emit about 800 kilos of CO2 for every ton of cement. So we look at both those kind of factors when we determine our impact. Overall, our base case is that we could do probably between 10 to 15 million tons of emission reductions if we get into a half a dozen cement plants at scale by 2030. By 2050, we'd expect that number to be much higher, given, we emit about 3 billion tons of emissions from cement production every year. In an aggressive case, what we're really hopeful for is some of the investors that come from the cement industry that own a few hundred cement plants between them. They really double down on our technology over the next few years. And if that were to happen, and if we were, built into the standard cement plant design come, 2030, 2032, there's a very good chance that we could be affecting as much as a third of the emissions that are produced from the cement industry every year. Like, technically, we've shown that's possible. We've shown economically it can be done without, making cement twice or three times as expensive than it is today. In fact, there's an argument to be made that we could make it even kind of the same price or perhaps even cheaper at scale. So if that aggressive scenario were to play out, we could be affecting billions of tons of emissions on a decade basis.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, we're gonna have you're somebody to watch, Apoorv. I'm gonna continue to follow you. This is fantastic. Do we have any questions from our virtual audience in the last minute that we have?
There's one up here.
Oh, there's somebody from the virtual audience that has a question.
Yeah, so the viewer was asking JP about Indigenous communities that are still on diesel. I don't know if that's outside of the scope of this conversation, but I just thought I'd pass it along.
I think it's right in the scope of this project. Do we want to keep burning diesel? The challenge is communities are very small, so how do you actually make them viable? For the folks that are familiar with the Wata-Kiniap line, which is electrifying a whole bunch of communities in Northern Ontario, those are the types of models we've got to start to look at. And we've got to really think about wheeling, or the ability to put energy on the grid. You know how frustrating it would be if you saw, if your company saw an electric line go by and all you can do is maybe, which is nice to have clean energy, but if you also have an energy project that you can actually put energy on the line, but you don't have the ability to do that, a lot of our northern communities, if we can have the ability to put energy on the line, maybe the economics will start to change so that we can actually sustain our own community. And a lot of these communities can't even build another house or another business or anything else because they're limited by because of the cap on how much electricity they produce. But they don't have really any other economic outlet. So we got to really think differently about the way that we provide economic entrepreneurial opportunities for northern communities. It's not going to work for every community. There are communities that have diesel, batteries, solar, microgrids. Those are some really interesting opportunities. But we also need to think about how communities like Five Nations Energy in Ontario are actually their own license holders, can actually transmit energy and be license holders. I think that's going to empower more communities, forgive the pun, to be able to contribute to the economy and contribute to the clean energy transition.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. I'm really sorry about that. We're just out of time. I want to thank JP and Apoorv, both of you, for your very insightful comments. And this has been a really great conversation, very informative. So thank you on behalf of the Globe and Mail for taking the time today. I'd now like to welcome back to the stage my wonderful colleague, Don Kalea, who is editor of the Report on Business magazine.
Hi, everybody. I'm back. And thank you so much, Rita, JP, Apoorv. That was fantastic. I mean, y'all can stay, but... Our next panel will focus on what executive leaders are doing to forge net zero strategies and meet expectations from investors, clients, and consumers. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Jeanette Erikvist, President of Ericsson Canada, Gabriela Silva, Manager of Sustainability at TransAlta, Colin Gouldeman, Director of Sustainable Finance for Commercial Financial Services at RBC, and Mohammed Ali, Vice President of Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs at Agnico Eagle. Thank you all for joining me. I will move over here now. So why don't we start just by hearing a little bit more about what each of you do as it relates to the road to net zero. Jeanette, who wants to jump in? Go for it.
Who wants to go first? Colin, you look
Oh,
eager.
sure, okay, I'll lead us off. Hi, everyone, I'm Colin Goldman. I'm the Director of Sustainable Finance in the mid-market commercial bank at RBC. So I work with our business clients to understand transition, conceptualize it, build business strategies around that, and then where relevant for their financial needs to offer sustainable debt solutions. And really what that means is helping them navigate transition and invest in decarbonization solutions in a way that really works for their businesses. So we advise them to do that.
Jeanette. This is big grade school vibes here.
So hi, my name is Jeanette Erikvist, President of Ericsson Canada. And what we do is you actually touch our products probably every day when you're calling of the wireless networks. Our customers are the operator in Canada. So 60% of the networks here in Canada are built on our portfolio. So anything wireless, more or less, is what we touch on. And first, I just want to say then that, we talked today so many different aspects, and it's interesting to say, I don't see Xavier here now, but when he talked about business imperative, that this has, that the discussion we're having now is moved away from something that is nice to have, but actually is something that we need to have, and we're all are working with it. And already I see, was it $3 billion was the cost for severe weather effects in Canada last year. I mean, the money that is costing us, but with what's climate change, is something that we have to all really be into. So what Ericsson is focusing on, I would say there are many areas, and we'll talk more about it, but let's just touch on our portfolio perspective. So Ericsson has worked with this. We always have sustainability is kind of top of our agenda. And Clark, I don't see where you're at, but I think we're in that top 2% that you were saying. We've been reporting on this for the past 30 years. So it's really been kind of top of mind. And we said that 90% of the emissions that we're involved in comes really from the portfolio. So it's really about how do we ensure to work with sustainability from a perspective, from an R&D perspective and a product development perspective. And that's really about how do you drive and bring in new innovative technologies into our portfolio. That's our kind of the main focus. So if you look at, for example, you hear about the 5G rollout, so how we're building the 5G and the new technologies in the industries. Compared to the 4G, so previous generations of technologies, the products we're now deploying are 10 times as energy efficient than the previous technology. So that's really what we see, the leaps that technology is offering. And one thing I can just say, an example to make it a little bit more tangible. So Rogers is one of our customers. They saw that since 2015, the data and the traffic, the real amount of data in the network was increasing 500 times. And of course, the power consumption is also increasingly many times with that. But at the same time, by utilizing the products, the new technologies, and by utilizing new software and everything that we can provide them, and from an intelligence perspective for the networks, they were able to reduce the carbon emissions with 3,000 ton metrics. And for those that, like me, likes it tangible, that means around 450 households full year of power consumption. And if we would have wanted to compensate it in any other way, we would have planted 143,000 trees. So it's really about how do you bring that technology into the networks deployed by our customers and obviously other stakeholders.
Right, very cool. Mohammed?
Sure. Wow, that's going to be a tough act to follow. So I'm the Vice President for Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs for Agnico Eagle Mines. We are a mining company, for those who couldn't figure that part out. But the best kept secret within Canada, we're the largest mining operator within Canada, the second largest or third largest, depending on which way you look at it, gold mining company in the world. When it comes to sustainability, what you may or may not realize with mining is a lot of the things we're hearing about today, a lot of the technologies, the taxonomy, et cetera, is looking into new technology, and that new technology requires various metals and minerals for us to get there. So our role really is to try to find a way to make sustainable renewable materials or metals in a way that helps renewable technology move forward. What you also may not realize is the challenges in the mining sector, they present some challenges and opportunities. We tend to be in operations in areas where we're with Indigenous partners. So JP was talking about Indigenous partners. The mining sector has been partnering with the Indigenous communities ever since we've been operating. So it's been a big part of what we do. So we do think we can bring some of that for the other sectors. The other thing is where we are in our journey on sustainability, at least on the carbon, the first carbon is easier to remove than the last carbon. And to give you some perspective on where the gold mining, the industry average globally is about 0.8 tons of CO2 per ounce of gold. So 0.8, we're about 0.39. So it's hard to start working. So we have to really be creative, working with partners and looking things outside the box. And the last thing I wanted to say is, though we are primarily in the gold space, we do know that we are going to be leaders in the mining space within Canada and globally. We do operate in Australia, Mexico, Finland, and Canada. And Canada itself is looking to us to look into how we can mine better tomorrow than we did today. And the last thing, as part of the intro, I also sit on the board of the CSSB, which probably will be coming up later as well.
Gabriela?
Good afternoon, everybody. Gabriela Silva. I'm the manager of sustainability at TransAlta. As part of my role, I lead the sustainability and climate strategy for the organization and the reporting as well, and that includes our net zero target by 2045. I'm extremely proud of our organization. We've been reporting on sustainability and climate for 30 years. Our first GHG reduction target was set in 1994. And so the energy transition conversation and climate change is not something new in our organization, and it's definitely embedded in the way we do business and the way we operate at our facilities. Just to give you a perspective of our decarbonization journey, since 2005, we've reduced approximately 10% of Canada's 2030 target in alignment with the Paris Agreement. So it's huge. We're talking 31 million megatons, of CO2e. It is impressive, and I'm extremely proud to be here representing the organization.
Getting rid of coal helps?
Absolutely.
So, Mohammed, you've talked a little bit about challenges, but I'd like to talk a little bit about which challenges each of your organizations faces. And I think when we spoke ahead of this, you mentioned that for Agnico Eagle, coming up with a sustainability plan is different. Is every single one is unique. So, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I'll touch on it, and I will say that every industry has its own challenge. If there was whatever analogy you want to say, the silver bullet, we wouldn't be here. The mining sector, the challenge we have is every ore body is in different parts of the world. They have different grades, different climates, different altitudes, different personnel, workforce, et cetera, remoteness, access, no access to power. So which means that each mine is designed uniquely. Now, how that's an opportunity is we're designing custom carbon-related solutions also uniquely. It allows us to look at each problem differently. But there's also, it comes with its challenge and opportunity, because if there was a technology out there, we have 12 assets, only one of the assets could possibly use it. The second thing in the mining sector is that the life of the asset just really changes the return on investment. So if you have an asset that's going to be expired in 8 years because you've run out of metal, you may not have the same return on investment as an asset that's running perpetually in some other sectors. And then I think lastly is what makes the net zero challenge different for the mining sector is out of our 12 assets, aside from 2, there's going to be no other mine within Agnico's portfolio by 2050. So in theory, we could be net zero by just doing nothing.
Right.
But we have to build a future. So we're like, our focus on technology today is to pilot test what we can so we can build the future mines without problems. Mm-hmm. So we're really focused on the future of mining, because you may not be able to change what's today, but that presents an opportunity for us that we can build a new one from ground up. Right. No pun intended.
Colin?
Yeah, I want to hop in on that actually, because I think it really underscores nicely what we're seeing. And I'll speak a little bit about what we're hearing mostly from our clients, because I think that's, where the business bank is doing a lot of its work, is engaging with our clients to understand how they see transition, how we can support, and how we can advise them, on the projects that they're undertaking. And I think what you said, Mohammed, really underscores, I think, the two challenges we see. The first is, this concept of a green premium that's still too high. So doing, a project cleanly with fewer carbon emissions is, in a lot of cases more expensive than doing it the way we've always done it with the emissions that we have. And I think, that's one part of the problem. But when we think about the business perspective on this, what matters more than necessarily the cost is the return you're getting on the capital you've invested. And what Mohammed was saying is that, the life cycle of these assets is maybe too short to get your full payout on the CapEx that you're going to do in this project. And that's something we're hearing a lot. It costs more, and I can't get my return at a reasonable rate, or even more importantly, nobody's going to pay for it. There's no demand for this decarbonized product. And so what I think it's incumbent on the folks in this room to do is to think about, where does my business sit in that journey? How do I, am I a business that delivers demand for decarbonized goods? Can I take off green steel or greener gold or whatever that might be? Or is my role in providing technology? Can I help technologies come down the cost curve? And so I think that's where the bank sees its role as offering advice and structuring smart financial solutions to help, where we can, bring the IRR for our clients up. And there's some examples we can get into on that. But when I think about work we're doing with the real estate sector, district energy is something that we've heard a lot from our clients that they want. And so we've been very thoughtful about how we structure the lending to those entities in a way that can unlock greener buildings, greener master planned communities by decarbonizing their heating sources. And so that, I think, is the role of the financial sector in helping bring IRRs in line with the higher carbon alternative.
Gabriella or Janet, want to jump in on challenges?
On the challenges, yeah, absolutely. I think I'm going to follow in terms of Mohammed, in terms of the technology piece. So what we're seeing at TransAlta is that there is definitely uncertainty regarding the timing of deployment of net zero technologies for what we do and be able to support electricity generation. And with that in mind, a couple of years ago, the organization put in place a team dedicated to looking to energy innovation and net zero technologies to support, again, electricity generation. So one of the things that the team has been focusing on, and I find it very innovative, is actually repurposing existing sites. So instead of looking at new projects, not that they were not doing that, we're also doing that, but we were actually trying to look at existing sites and see if we can use that site to actually test a couple of technologies. So we do have, for example, we have a partnership with a company called X Energy, where we have an SMR feasibility study undergoing at our thermal plant in Alberta. We also have partnership with ZEP Energy, and that one is a nuclear fusion pilot, which is very innovative in a gas plant in Washington State. We also have I think it's Sand Hills project, if I'm not mistaken, where we're actually building a solar farm in the pits of an old mine that we closed in just close to Edmonton in Alberta. So our Highvale mine. So anyway, it's just a few examples of how we can look at the legacy and existing and decommissioning sites and extend that into the future, the net zero future. We are also investing in new technology. So we have some equity investment in a kind of a startup for hydrogen production, and we continue to look at other opportunities. So I do think that that is the uncertainty piece that I see. So it's very difficult for us today to say, in the next 10 years or 20 years, this is how much we're going to decrease our GHG emissions based on this technology or that technology, because we don't know, right, at this point. And so there is a lot of investment, there's a lot of investigation, and we're taking it very seriously.
Jeanette?
Short note. And I think that the biggest challenge, I think, a little bit of pace of change. So coming back to what you asked before, is like, so Ericsson has set, our target is really that by 2040, we should be net zero across our full value chain. And that's obviously more aggressive than the 2050 targets that we often are discussing. But beyond that, also we've said that to hold ourselves accountable for those of us that will be here for, we're still going to be here for some time, and maybe if not for 2040, by 2030, we need to be net zero across our own operations, and we should be at least halving our the net zero across the value chain. So we're making sure that we have these targets. I think it's that pace of change and making sure that other ones are, because you can't do it on your own. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about collaborations and how important it is across industries, because it's really, if you're going to get that across the value chain, it's really how do we ensure that we all work from suppliers to ourselves to our customers and across. And I can only reflect, on our customers' behalf then that, if they're looking at, the power consumption and the cost for energy for them to run the networks, it's about 5% of the revenues. And it's increasing for every year, and it's increasing much faster than really their sales growth. So obviously there is something to be said, and I think that you are maybe more in that space around affordable energy and renewable energy that is affordable, and that we have to work on those. So it's really how do we ensure that we work on all aspects across all the value chains to really see the challenges, because if we're on our own, we won't see the full effect of what we're really trying to get to.
Yeah, it's those scope 3s that are the real tricky part. I sat on a panel once, and they were talking about how they moved everything to the cloud. And so they were much more energy efficient within their operation. And I was like, you're missing the net part. Like, that still exists. Those emissions still exist somewhere out there, just not on your books. So this is sort of for... So how do you sort of ensure that, speaking from a leadership perspective, how do you ensure that net zero goals and how important this all is sort of trickles down from the highest ranks of the company to sort of the rank and file to make sure you're all kind of moving in the right direction and everybody understands the importance of what you're doing? I don't know who wants to jump in here. We want to just start back down at the end of the line.
Sure. Yes. In terms of in this area, and every company has it differently, I'm sure. And from a governance point of view and how ensuring everything's happening, there's the top-down approach and then there's the bottom-up approach. And I can tell you all kinds of cliches of all the ways to do this. But ultimately, you've got to have the whole organization all pointed in the right direction. Therefore, you have to have a goal. So some of the concepts around net zero and 30% reduction by 2030, one of the value I found of it is whether you hit your target or not, and I think most people are trying to hit it, is it gives you some focus. You say, okay, where are we going? Let's build strategies backwards towards it. If I go up to bat and I swing and I miss, or I hit a home run, better than not even showing up to bat. So we took some effort into looking at our robust plans of 2030. We're like, yeah, we think we can hit it. Can we do even better? Let's look into that. But ultimately, number one, have a goal. Number two, you've got to get the employees engaged because they know the business. You can't just have the board and the CEO saying, here's our goal, here's our vision, let's go do it. So we've been focusing a lot around, so we just had last week our climate action team meeting. They presented from site to the CEO what their ideas are, what's going to happen, how they're going to do it. Everyone was excited. And again, I'm sure every organization has those, but it's important to engage every level because if someone doesn't feel that they're part of the solution, you're missing out on a huge capital. The third is those partnerships, and not saying that the partnerships we have in mining, we've got energy partners, we've got communication partners, where we're located in areas where we have indigenous partners. So we're like, okay, well, we have a mine remotely. We need 5G network, so we're going to build our own transmission line to get there, get the indigenous communities on board so they have access to education, fiber optics, et cetera, power lines, transmissions. We need all that anyway. When JP was talking about involve the communities so that they're involved, we're a business out there. So now you have some return to say, okay, we can be a major customer, use us to build out that infrastructure, and we enjoy that because we need those partnerships. We can't solve this alone. This is a team sport. So I'll stop there and let others add to it.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I'll say, echo everything you've just said, Mohammed. But I think, so the bank has a number of targets in our portfolio, both, operating carbon associated with our, business travel and office towers and branch network. But, more than that, I think, the bank is focused on financed emissions, and we've set out net zero banking alliance commitments to be net zero in that lending by 2050 and are setting interim targets in sectors. We've done power and utilities, oil and gas and transportation thus far, and we'll be setting a couple more in the coming years. But I think the trick there is that those aren't emissions that we have. They're a bit like those cloud emissions. You know, there are things we're doing that cause emissions to be created by clients of ours. And so I think the critical piece there, when you're in a kind of intermediary role in the market, is to ensure that all of your employees and all of their client engagements are advancing those goals and helping clients deliver decarbonization strategies and deliver decarbonized projects. And that means that your workforce has to be upskilled. And prior to this role I'm in now, I did some research. We published a piece called Green Collar Jobs, and it was really looking at the underlying skills shift in the labor force that was happening because of transition. And I'm actually an example of this. I'm an economist by training. I took one environmental economics class, and now I deliver sustainable finance. That's, it took a lot of retraining for myself to get to where I'm at today. And I think we have to do that with thousands of business client advisors, thousands of personal banking colleagues of ours. We're doing that. We're delivering training. We're offering, we're trying to help them have these conversations. We're enabling that conversation with our clients, and then also creating technology tools to help Canadian farmers understand emissions from their fields or from their cattle, I don't know what it's called, herds. I was going to say flock, but it's a herd.
Not to make it jump into agriculture.
So I think the point I'm trying to make really is that, in an intermediary part of the market, it's about facilitating. We facilitate emissions, and we can also facilitate emissions cuts. And that means making sure that the frontline staff that are working with clients every day have the tools they need, and then the clients have the tools they need. So we're making those investments in technology, just like Jeanette is doing, to make sure that we have the information we need to make business smart decisions on climate action.
Gabriele, I think it was you who mentioned when we did our prep call that, it's a real hiring and retention issue, net zero.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely. What I'm seeing is that it is very difficult for companies nowadays to recruit talent if you don't have a net zero strategy. That's just the way it is. I'm seeing some of my peers spending sometimes even a year trying to find that right person with that right capability, to your point, because we just cannot find in the market. So in recognition of that, our climate transition plan, we have a pillar that's called inclusive transition, and under that pillar, we have the focus on the people. I'd call it the people side. So there are targets there for ED&I, so equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's targets there for recruiting and retaining talent. And I do believe that net zero is cross-functional, right? So we have to understand that. It's not just about the technology, right? It seems to me, especially, I don't know, maybe because I'm in the energy sector, you got this technology put in place and reduce your emissions, but it's so much more than that, right? It really shapes the way you engage with your customers, the way you engage with your suppliers, the way you actually are hiring, right? The way you are supporting and partnering with community, with local communities, with indigenous communities. So it really goes across. And if you don't have that as part of your strategy as an organization, you're not going to get to net zero. So it's so beyond the technological race.
So I'll answer both of those questions in once to be efficient. Yeah. No, but if you look at kind of leadership and how you, as a leadership, how do you really promote it internally? And we talked about targets. I actually just want to kind of echo everything that was said. So they made it rather easy, but obviously it starts on the top. So unless you're, if you don't put in targets, then you don't measure it. And I think for us, it's not just about one thing. It goes across everything we do. So if I'm looking at R&D, our research and development, they are targets on how do they ensure that they are employing this into how they bring in new innovative technologies into anywhere from how do we bring AI into how we operate our networks versus how do we ensure that we have the 5G technology. Now we're going to 6G. How do we ensure to bring that into the technology? Same on product development. They will also work on that. And then you look across, all the different parts of the company. But then we have, and I think we talked about it a little bit from the broadest perspective, and I think it's rather telling that we are 4 very different kind of businesses, if I put it that way, but we're all saying the same thing in different words. And I think that collaboration across industries is what's absolutely necessary to make this happen. So if you looked at our own research, if you only look at what we do, it's about 1.4 percent of the carbon emission, which is not very much as such. But because we do what we do, we're such an enabler, and we talked about mining. It's one of our favorite strong industries, especially here in Canada, that we enable and work with. And if you look at what we enable from industry and all our customers and stakeholders, we see that we can lower the emissions with 15 to 20% going to 2030 if we work across our industries with our all stakeholders. So it's really about how that comes together. And I think that's very important. And then if you just tie it into kind of the engagement part, so of course, and I was in Montreal last week and met with a lot of our interns, and somebody who's old as I am, so like meeting those kind of 20 plus, it's it's fantastic, and they're so energized, and they're so driving, and you're asking them, so why Ericsson? Why did you come here? I mean, we're not that sexy maybe compared to other industries. And they were like, no, like you have such a great AI, technology and all the new technologies, and it's put into context of what they want to drive. And then you come back to that, well, I get to drive something around the sustainability, I get to see how it's deployed and how it's being used, and that really draws them into the company. So I think that's both what you're doing every day across the stakeholder environment, but then how people themselves really get to engage in what they're doing and seeing the results of it. And finally, that engagement part of, so I am the very proud executive sponsor of our North American Sustainability Council, where all of our employees get to engage in all these different activities, which can be beyond the typical work because they want to do something else. If that's having webinars or seminars or run events, or they will be doing a cleanup in the park locally. There's so much other engagement that you need to kind of release, and that you can also do as part of really talent strategy today.
So we're down to our last 5 minutes, but I just wanted to ask one last question of all of you, and we'll do sort of a lightning round. But sort of what's one thing you'd like to see happen that will help your organization hit net zero? And Mohammed, I don't want to be leading, but CSSB.
Sure, maybe I'll
come into play here.
Yeah, maybe I'll hit the CSSB angle here. We talked about disclosure as I was listening to some of the earlier discussion, and the focus on disclosure. We've got to be very mindful, and all of you in the room, I'd like you to be able to be mindful. There's precision and there's progress. We're getting caught up in the precision. We're getting caught up in the significant digits of disclosure and not action and not progress. I think we need to make sure our disclosure decision useful. We need to make sure that we're moving towards progress and what are we doing about it. The other stuff of things I'd like to wish, I think that'd be a long list, and I think in 3 minutes I would not be able to do it. It'll take away from my colleagues, and they're going to wish they had more time.
Colin?
Sure. So, I mean, it's going to sound simple when I say it, I think. But what we need to do, civil society, businesses, and government collectively, is ensure that the low carbon solution is the most affordable and most, creating of the highest returns for businesses at all. That we're not doing this kind of, should I do the brown thing? Should I do the green thing? Should I do the kind of something in between thing? It's got to be the green thing, the low carbon thing at the highest return at the lowest cost. That sounds simple. It's very hard. And it's, I think, a concerted effort by all those actors to really run those numbers and identify where, is it policy that's going to lead here? Is it disclosure that's going to get us there? Is it, smart financing, changing terms and conditions, that kind of thing that's going to deliver that? Is it visionary business leadership to say, this is the way I see my industry going in the future? That, identification of what's going to work and what's going to make it cheaper and faster to deploy, that's really what we have to be laser focused on. There's aspects of that where the government's leading, things like the ITCs, if they can come off the ground, the investment tax credits for clean technology, if they can come off the ground, those will change the IRR calculations for businesses for deploying these new technologies. There's areas where those won't be the right tool, and we have to find the right tool for the right job.
Gabrielle?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to see at the high level is that recognition that it takes time, right? It takes time, and it's cross-functional, and it's not going to be a straight line. It seems to me that there is an understanding out there that you find that technology, you put that in place, and you're going to decarbonize, and then you're done. And it's really not like that. I think we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in this space and understand that it's going to be a bumpy road. It's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be a smooth ride to get to net zero, in our case, by 2045. But I think the word I would like to choose here is resilience, right? And resilience is that piece of you're working to build a resilience environment within the organization to be able to transition in terms of your energy production, but at the same time be successful at the end, right? And being cross-functional and recognizing that. So I think I would like to see holistically from governments, from the standards board, all the understanding that it takes time, right, to be able to get there.
No, just quickly, I think these were such great things, just fantastic. And really, if anything, I would ask is, can we, how can we all kind of hold ourselves accountable and maybe hold each other accountable? So, for example, we joined the Canadian government's Net Zero Challenge just recently to celebrate Earth Day, where there are so many companies and businesses across Canada that are in it, and they're all driving to this change of Net Zero 2050. But if we're more joining and holding each other accountable and working together, I think we can move much faster. So that would be maybe additional ask.
Right. I'm afraid that we are out of time. So if you have burning questions, either you can capture these people outside or find them. I'm sure they're all findable on the internet. Thank you so much for being here, to all of you. That was really fantastic. I could have gone on for quite some time.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, John. Thank you. You are all released. That concludes today's event. I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for being here and all of our speakers for the insights they've shared today. That's been a fantastic day. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to give another shout out to Ericsson, Schneider Electric, and RBC for sponsoring today's event. And as I mentioned, please do stick around for the networking reception just outside. We'll see you there. Thanks again.